Joe Biden's trip to the Middle East, his first trip as president and his second day of his Israel trip. And a short time ago, I spoke to Arise's Middle East analyst, Dr. Saul Zadka. I began by asking his assessment of President Biden's stance on Iran and if the US is prepared to use all elements of his national power to stop them from acquiring nuclear weapons. How would you characterize and assess that sentence? What does it mean to you?
Well, yeah, but it has been said by President Biden in Jerusalem today with some kind of a caution. He said diplomacy would be the best mean to stop the Iranians from pursuing their nuclear program, and using force would be a last resort. At the same time, his Israeli counterpart, Mr. Lapid, said that Israel would use its own force to stop Iran not only from implementing its nuclear program, but also using proxies to destabilize the region like Hezbollah, Hamas, or Islamic Jihad. On this point, they saw eye to eye with Biden, and there is also a hint in this joint Jerusalem declaration that the Americans will support any measure that Israel would take against Iran, even though it would not be participating in using force at that very stage. And I think that Mr. Biden has a difficulty here because he would have liked to sign a new nuclear deal with Iran, contrary to the wishes of his Israeli hosts, because he wants also sanctions against Iran to be lifted, paradoxically, because Iran would be able to produce oil, and that will bring about a reduction of the oil prices around the world.
So how significant is the signing of this strategic partnership between Israel and the US? Is it enough to reassure the Israeli government that the US is there and ready to deal with the threat posed by Iran?
The declaration was mostly symbolic, I would say. It was very strong on bombastic assurances that Israel would never walk alone and America would always support it. But there is a lingering suspicion that the United States would not go all the way in order to subdue the Iranians. Rather, they would be tempted to sign a nuclear deal with Iran without any attempt to tame the proxies that destabilize the region. Don't forget, after all, when this deal has been signed in 2015, when Obama was the president and Mr. Biden was his vice president, any inclusion of other issues rather than the Iranian nuclear deal has been definitely removed. The support that Iran is giving to militant regimes around the Middle East, including the Houthis in Yemen, has not been part of the deal. And that's why the Israelis are not 100% assured that Americans will support it fully when it comes to a confrontation with Iran.
And how are Israelis viewing President Biden's visit? He's got his own domestic troubles. Are there concerns about the impact of America's polarized politics on its long-term support? Also, those on the left wing of the Democratic Party who really want Joe Biden to take a much tougher stance on Israel.
On the Palestinian issues, definitely, but Biden dismissed them as a lone voice, nothing significant, and certainly not something that represents or reflects the American mood towards Israel or towards the Israeli-Arab conflict in general. But many Israelis, like other observers in the Middle East, view Biden as a weak leader who is coming to beg the Saudi ruler for reducing the price of oil. And the fact that he came to Jerusalem is only a transitional act on his way to Saudi Arabia tomorrow, where his most important trip will take place. So not necessarily a lame duck, but given the fact that the news from America on its dire economic situations would not definitely make Biden a very strong leader in the eyes of Middle Eastern leaders.
And we've seen previous countless trips by US presidents to Israel would have the Israeli-Palestinian peace negotiations front and center. That's not the case on this trip. We know President Biden is due to meet Palestinian leaders, but how frustrating do you think would that be for Palestinians that it's hardly being discussed?
Biden said that this is not the time to start reviving Palestinian-Israeli dialogue. He will definitely tell that to Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian leader, tomorrow when he meets him in Bethlehem. He also understands that Mr. Lapid cannot do much as a prime minister who is only a caretaker, and during an election campaign, Israel cannot make any significant progress towards the Palestinians rather than easing the economic pressure in the West Bank. So it is quite predictable to think that after the Israeli elections, more American pressure would be applied on Israel to start making concessions to the Palestinians. And this is something Biden said today. I am still a supporter of the two-state solution. And he even got the support of Mr. Lapid. But Lapid is not going to make any significant measures, although in anticipation to Biden's visit to Jerusalem, he did speak to the Palestinian president in order to ease tension in the region.
Arise Middle East analyst Dr. Saul Zadka, thank you.